Hi everyone. Today we are going to continue talking about cognition and language, and this time we're going to focus on language. So we know that human language is pretty complex. We do see that different cultures have some kind of language, whether spoken, written, sounds, gestures. There's lots of variation in languages across different cultures, but yeah, we do see that every human culture does have some kind of language. The click language is thought to be one of the earliest forms of language, and some cultures do still use the click language. And I have a video up here, or it's on the lecture guide too. And this is optional if you want to observe some of the click language. It is really interesting that the sounds are kind of different. The sounds are like kinds of things, but it's a language and they use it to communicate, and they have different sounds that can represent different symbols or different words or things like that. I mean, it's a regular language and it is very different sounding to us and very interesting. So I encourage you to click on the link and listen to the language a little bit, but you don't have to if you don't want to. There are a few other videos in this lecture that are required, especially when we get to animal communication, whether it's language or not. So the click language, I do encourage you to because it is interesting, but this video is optional. Let's talk a little bit about what is a language. If we try to define language and try to think about what are the key features of human language, it's actually very difficult to define. But researchers have come up with 3 key features of human language. So one of the key features is semanticity. This involves using specific or abstract symbols to represent something. For example, the word baby represents a baby. And it is abstract because if we think about just focus on the written word, that there's nothing about that really kind of reflects a baby. Or if we think about the sound of it, baby, that doesn't really sound like a baby, right? It's not like, you know, or something that would represent crying, that would represent a baby, or, you know, whatever. I'm making baby sounds. But yeah, just the sound of the word baby, the look of the word baby, we know, you know, those of us who are familiar with English know that baby represents a baby. But it is abstract. If you were just, you know, learning the language and you're thinking like, why does this word represent baby? So it is that kind of abstract symbol, which we can think symbol as a written symbol, the written word. We can think of it as a sound. We can think about sign language is a language too. So we can think about the movement, the gesture, that is the word for baby. So yeah, semanticity is one of the key features. Another key feature of human language is that it is productive, that you can produce new utterances. You can produce new words, you can create new words. And so in human language, as long as people are following the rules of their language, how to put sounds together, they can create new words, they can create new meanings of existing words. There's a lot of creativity, a lot of flexibility. One thing that we do a lot of is blending. We can create new words by blending existing words. So one example, if you remember from the movie Mean Girls, the Lindsay Lohan character, what was it? She started to say great, and then she said cool, right? And then we got gruel, which is an example of blending, and that's something that we do all the time. We can think about the word hangry, right? Hungry and angry. And it is, I believe it's in the dictionary now, it is an established word and a real thing, right? Hangry. But yeah, so we can create, we can produce new words. And yeah, isn't that so fetch? Okay, that was from the Mean Girls too. And then another key feature of human language is displacement, that you can communicate about a range of things that are distant in time and or space. So you're not limited to the right now, talking about things that you can see right now, but more like you can think about things in the future. In a recent lecture, we were talking about trying to imagine what the future would be like. And so from the movie Back to the Future, Or we can think, more relevant for these days, we can think about when the pandemic is over and things go back to normal and we can go out with our friends and things like that. Or we can think about things in the past before the whole pandemic and how we used to go out with our friends and things like that. And maybe we're thinking about how much more grateful we are for those times that we've had and grateful for what we'll get in the future when this is over. But yeah, so we can think about things in the past, in the present, and in the future. We can think about things that are not very close to us. Obviously, we can be thinking about our loved ones. We can think about, other things in life, not just what's right here, right now. So when we think about the definition, the overall definition of language, what researchers have come up with to try to cover this is language is an arbitrary system of symbols governed by rules and allows communication about things that are distant in time or space. So we can see kind of it's encompassing these different features. We've got the semanticity, that is a system of symbols. We've got governed by rules. As long as you're following the rules, you can produce new utterances. And then the displacement that allows communication about things that are distant in time or space. One thing to kind of keep in mind when we're talking about language is that there is a difference between language comprehension and language production. For example, when we think about humans, when we talk about babies, young individuals, babies, toddlers, young kids, what we see with language development is that kids can understand language long before they can produce language. So they can understand what we're saying before they can produce the following the rules grammatical speak. So keep that in mind. Let's kind of shift gears and think about across different species, thinking about are humans the only ones who have language? If we were in class, we would have a really awesome debate. I'm sure you guys would come up with some really good thoughts thinking about, do other species have language? When we're talking about like different animals, we know that they definitely communicate with each other, right? Bees, dogs, cats, animals, they communicate with each other and across other species too. They definitely communicate, but is that language? And there's actually quite a bit of debate about that whether their communication is considered to be language or not. Some people think, yes, it is language. Some people think, no, it's not. Some people are kind of like, nah, I don't know. But yeah, it's really hard. And again, going back to our definition of language and the features of language, it's kind of hard to say. So let's talk about some differences between humans and other species in terms of language. If we are considering other species to have language, we do definitely see some differences between human and other species. So one of the big differences we see is that human language has high productivity. A lot of species don't have any productivity. They can't come up with new words. They just basically repeat or use what has been said. And again, productivity is that ability to improvise, to create new signals, new symbols to represent new ideas. So create the new words, do the blending, come up with gruel, come up with hangry, right? As long as you're following the rules of the language and the sounds that work together, you can come up with new words or different combinations of words or things like that. And so that's what we see definitely in human language, but not necessarily in the language or communication of other species. Let's talk about a few examples. And there has been research trying to teach language or trying to communicate between humans and other species. And so there's been a lot of research, a lot of work that has been done with chimpanzees. And a lot of people do think that chimpanzees do use language, but it is different from human language. So one of the things is that chimpanzees seldom use symbols in new original combinations. So there's been research done trying to teach chimpanzees sign language, trying to communicate, like talking, the human might talk to the chimpanzee and try to train them to push some buttons or something to respond or give them the toy or whatever, things like that. In terms of producing, that's the chimpanzees don't really do they don't really produce new words, right? They seldom use the symbols, the words in new original combinations, and they're usually using to request something like want water as opposed to describe water is lovely, you know, something like that was a bad example. But how they're using the symbols, they're just kind of repeating using what's been heard, what they've been exposed to. They're not producing that new, they're not coming up with original creative kinds of symbols, and they're mostly requesting and not describing. And here's a picture that they're reacting to colored plastic chips. So this would be an example where the researcher is kind of talking to the chimpanzee and chimpanzee is responding, you know, however, with these, in this case, some plastic chips. Bonobos have, there's been a lot of research with bonobos too. And bonobos actually, their behavior resembles humans in a lot of ways in terms of social behavior, parenting behavior, some sexual behavior too, in that they will engage in sex not just for the sake of reproduction, but as a bonding kind of thing. So yeah, we definitely see a lot of similarities in bonobo behavior. And then we also see some similarities with language too. So one thing that we see with bonobos, and again, going back to the idea of language comprehension compared to language production, that there does seem to be evidence that bonobos can understand, they can comprehend more than they can produce. They can use symbols and names to describe objects. They can request items not seen, so that displacement feature, that they can request items not seen, they can use symbols to describe past events, they can make original creative requests. So we do see that these are some similarities with human language too. There have been a few bonobos that have been used a lot in research. Kanzi is one that there's a video that you guys are going to watch where they actually trained Kanzi's parents. Kanzi observed that, and then they trained Kanzi as well to point to answers on the board, like they would ask the question and Kanzi is kind of pointing to answers and things like that. So this is the video. This is really interesting, showing some of that communication, some of the language between the human researcher and Kanzi. So this is a required video to watch and see this. In trying to explain what's going on with this language, so Kanzi and Malika is his sister, that they seem to have greater language potential than other chimpanzees. One thing too with these, the research started when they were really young. They observed their parents getting trained by the researchers, and then the researchers trained Kanzi and Malika as well. So there was the observation, or learning through observation, when they were observing the researchers train the parents, and then observation and then imitation. And of course, there was a lot of positive reinforcement. You say the thing, you get a, you know, a seed or something. There's also been some research with non-primates to look and see about how much that they engage in language. You know, obviously they do communication, but whether that's language or not is the debate. And so, of course, we know that a lot of parrots especially can repeat words, right? Can repeat words or phrases that are said, and you can train them. And this is interesting, Alex. And here's another video which is required, and this is so interesting, that they are supposedly, well, you can think about what you think about it, that they're asking Alex some questions and kind of like some math problems and things like that with different objects to like get familiarize himself with the objects and then answer questions about it. So it's not just that simple repeating what a lot of parrots will do, but you know, it seems like it's actually answering questions. And one of the things, it even seems like there's a bit of productivity too. That not just repeating phrases, but thinking about it and responding. This is really, really interesting to see Alex responding. So as we think about non-human language abilities, that actually gives us some insight back to human language abilities. And especially thinking about for people who might have some challenges in learning language, that might have a harder time learning language, which people with brain damage, especially depending on which areas of the brain are damaged. One of the most common symptoms, although not everyone with autism has difficulties with language, but many do in the autism spectrum disorder. But yeah, so thinking about what can we learn and how can we teach language to people who might have a harder time learning language. Also, as we're kind of thinking about where did language come from? Why do we have language? What's going on with this? And it does seem, or many people believe, that language has evolved from a precursor, since other species maybe have language too. And of course, one thing too, thinking about the research across different species and even the research among humans too, it also demonstrates how ambiguous our concept of language is. Going back to the definition, thinking about those 3 features, yeah, it's not the best definition, but if you tried to define language, what would you come up with? So it's definitely a tricky term, a tricky thing, right? Language is definitely abstract. How do we define it is a difficult task to try to define it. The definition that we do have is somewhat ambiguous, but is it even possible to narrow it down to make it more specific? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't though. But yeah, so yes, problems with the definition of language, but what are you gonna do, you know? Yeah, but think about if you were going to define language, how would you define it? But let's kind of talk more about this question, that where did language come from? How did it evolve? Why did it evolve? Why do we have language? There's a couple of main categories of theories trying to explain why we have language, why we learn language more easily than other species. One category of theories is basically that language evolved as a byproduct of brain development or a byproduct of intelligence. Basically, this category of theories is kind of saying that language was on accident. It was just this byproduct, which, as you can imagine, there are some problems with that theory. Another main category of theories is that language evolved as a brain specialization. So whereas the first one is kind of thinking that brain evolved on accident, this one is more like, no, it was intended, it was deliberate. There's specialization in the brain that is, you're predisposed to develop language. So we'll talk more about both of them. Let's start with the whole byproduct category. So obviously there are problems thinking about that if language developed as a byproduct of the brain development or a byproduct of intelligence, yeah, there are problems with that, because we do see that people with a full-size brain, normal overall intelligence, can show severe language deficits. We also see that people with impaired intelligence can have normal language skills. So this theory, yeah, it doesn't work. One of the examples, one of the conditions of having the impaired intelligence but normal language skills is Williams syndrome. This is a genetic syndrome where, yeah, there's some intellectual impairment, but skillful use of language. And we have an example here. This person has Williams syndrome, and she was asked to draw an elephant, which we have the drawing here, and then also write down a description of the elephant. So let's first start with the description here. What an elephant is, it is one of the animals. And what the elephant does, it lives in the jungle. It can also live in the zoo. And what it has long gray ears, fan ears, ears that can blow in the wind. It has a long trunk that can pick up grass or pick up hay. If they're in a bad mood, it can be terrible. If the elephant gets mad, it could stomp. It could charge like a bull can charge. They have long, big tusks. Goes on from there. This is a very thorough and impressive description of the elephant. But then if we look at the drawing here, well, first of all, just take a look at the overall. That doesn't really look a whole lot like an elephant. I'm tempted to think this is the ear. Oh yeah, that like Dumbo. But no, she's labeled, this is the body. Oh, okay, well, elephants have big bodies too. But if we look at, okay, here's the ear, here's the head, here's the eyes, what mouth, and yeah, this doesn't really look as much like an elephant, right? So yeah, like she can describe it just fine, but in terms of drawing it, and she clearly knows what it is, and then it has these different body parts, but as far as drawing it, not so much. Let's talk about then the other category of theories, the idea that language has evolved as that brain specialization. That there's maybe a module, there's some brain structures that are, specifically designed to be involved with language processing. And so Chomsky and Pinker are big language guys who propose that humans have this language acquisition device. It's this built-in mechanism that helps us acquire language. And we do see evidence for that, especially when we think about that most children, when they have some exposure to language, they develop language very easily. That's why we do think that there is some biological predisposition that we are predisposed to learn a language. What language we end up learning really depends on our exposure. What language are we surrounded with? What are we hearing as we grow up? And then that's the language that we develop. But yeah, this does seem to be built in because, again, if there is exposure, kids pick up on language very easily, whether you like it or not, especially for those of you with kids, and they sure do pick up on the bad language, right? Which you may not. But yeah, we've talked before about sensitive period in terms of like brain development, in terms of developing our sensory systems. We also have a sensitive period for language development. But again, if you don't have that early exposure, then that can lead to some impairment later on. I know we've talked a little bit about Jeannie before, and I do have a link to a video about Jeannie later on. And so Jeannie was that individual who was very severely abused and neglected. And they kept her tied to a chair in a dark room. She had no social interaction. She was malnourished. She didn't get to exercise. She barely got to walk around because they just kept her tied up all the time. And so when her parents did that, and then when they found her and they tried to help her and got her away from her parents, her father especially was really kind of very abusive. But yeah, so then they were, some psychologists were also kind of interested to do research to see, can she develop language? She was 12 years old when they found her. And to think about, there was no exposure to language, there was no social interaction. Of course, they were trying to help her too, and they cared about her. And they were able to teach her some language, but not, there were still challenges, and she wasn't, very fluent in the language. There was progress, but it wasn't, like how normative development would be. So we'll come back to Jeannie in a little bit. But let's think about bilingualism or multilingualism. And this would be such a fun discussion if we were in class. But I would ask you guys, is anyone bilingual, multilingual? What languages do you speak? Tell us, a few words in your language. Oh, I know, you guys probably wouldn't like that. But let's see. I am not a Spanish speaker, but in a previous semester, when we did this whole topic, one of my students taught me, and let me see if I say it right, me gusta psicología. Did I say it right? I think I said it right. But yeah, so yeah, we would have a great discussion about that. So thinking about if we're bilingual, if we're multilingual, I think we have actually talked a little bit about there's a lot of benefits for being bilingual or multilingual. Obviously, we can think about, for the job market, that's a very helpful skill to have. Obviously, you can make more friends, you can communicate with more people. We do see a lot of cognitive benefits too, that we see, we see that there can be, for kids who are, well, this kind of gets into this, that thing about when is the best time to learn a new language. And we'll come back to the cognitive benefits. When we're thinking about when is the best time to learn a new language, it's never too late to learn a new language. There are, of course, it can be easier to pick up on things the younger that you are. But there's also some things that we see. So like with younger kids, that the earlier that you start learning a second language, that kids especially are quicker to pick up on pronunciation and maybe some of those less familiar aspects of grammar. We actually see though that adults are actually better at learning vocabulary, but with the pronunciation. So we see that around 12 years old seems to be a little bit of kind of a milestone or kind of break off kind of point that you can still, of course, learn a language after 12 years old. But if you're starting to learn the language before 12 years old, you're more likely to be fluent and the pronunciation too, that you might be able to get closer to the native accent or not have an accent rather, and be more fluent in speaking the language. Although again, adults can pick up a second language too. And so, yeah. In general though, and especially if we think about like babies, when they're developing language for the first time, they're getting exposure to different languages, there can be a little bit of a delay if they're hearing multiple languages at the same time. That can be a little bit harder to learn, you know, these words or these sounds represent these words. And they might switch between languages as they're learning because it's all new. And so there can be a little bit of delay initially, but then again, later on, we do see a lot of benefits. We see that having, you know, being bilingual or multilingual can be related to some cognitive flexibility. It can be related to better executive control, better attention, better memory, kind of more language awareness, related to creativity. And especially when we think about the aging adult, we do see that being bilingual, and especially if you are constantly practicing the different languages, if you're constantly switching between your languages, it keeps your brain healthy. You know, we've talked before about cognitive exercise. Being bilingual and using those different languages is built-in cognitive exercise, which can keep your brain healthy. It can delay or possibly even prevent some of the declines in processing speed that we see from many aging adults. That we see even in terms of dementia, that we see that having that bilingual, that ability to be bilingual seems to be related to lower risk, lower rates of getting dementia. Because again, you have that built-in cognitive exercise, which is awesome. So we can all learn a new language, and I have a picture here of the owl of Duo from that app Duolingo, which I think we've talked about a little bit in class before. This is a free app you can get on your phone. You can pay for it too, but you can just do the free and you have ads and it's not a big deal. I have the free one. But yeah, so you can learn, they have a range of languages you can pick, and you can do fun little tasks and things like that. It's a cool thing, and there's so many benefits for learning at least another language. One thing too, when we think about brain activity, so again, remember both hemispheres are involved with language, but in general, the left hemisphere might be responding a little bit faster. But when you're picking up different languages, when you're bilingual from a young age, we do see more of the bilateral activity, so more activity in both of the hemispheres during speech for both languages. For older individuals, picking up a second language tends to be a little bit more activity than on the left hemisphere. Although again, both hemispheres are involved with language processing. One thing we mentioned before is that sign language is a language too. And the features of language apply to sign language as well. And kind of going back to that idea about the sensitive periods, that for deaf children, if they're unable to learn a spoken language, and if they're not given the opportunity to learn sign language while they're young, then there can be, again, some impairments later in life. So kind of along those lines, if they're not getting the early exposure, there can be language impairments later in life. So yeah, if they are given the opportunity to learn sign language or some kind of language, they'll develop their own language if they can, communicate with someone else to, develop some symbols or gestures or whatever to communicate. Kids will do that, even if it's not a spoken language. But again, if they don't have that opportunity and they're not getting that early exposure, then yeah, that makes it harder to develop a language skill later on. One thing too we see in general, and this applies with sign language, this applies with spoken language, that having early exposure to one language can increase the ability to learn another language later. Or especially back to bilingualism, learning a second language earlier on can make it a little bit easier that you can learn a third language later on. So let's use Duo and Duolingo and learn all kinds of languages. But yeah, that applies again to sign language and to spoken. And then this is that link for the Genie video that, again, those very rare cases that kids not exposed to language at all indicate that limited ability to learn language later. And she did learn, like, again, there was progress. She did learn some language, but it wasn't, you know, completely fluent. It wasn't like a normative language development for someone of her age. And so please do watch this. Oh, it's sad though, like do keep that in mind. Jeannie's case is very sad, but interesting too. All right, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about brain damage and language. So a lot of knowledge of the brain mechanisms involved with language actually comes from research with people who have had brain damage. Because then again, we can see like, oh, what brain structure, what brain area is damaged, and then see what are the effects of that, to then learn about the functions of those brain structures. So Broca's area and Wernicke's area are things that we've talked about early in the semester when we talked about neuroanatomy. And we have talked about Broca's aphasia and Wernicke's aphasia, but just to talk about it again a little bit. So Broca's area, if you have, don't remember, is in the frontal lobe, left cerebral cortex near the motor cortex. And we do see that when there is some damage to the Broca's area, there can be some impairment with language, especially with speech production. Aphasia is something that basically indicates that there are some impairments in language. So let's see, we can see Broca's area. We're going to talk again about Wernicke's area. They're both important for language in different ways. So with Broca's area, when there's damage to the Broca's area, Broca's aphasia, we also call this non-fluent aphasia. The big problem here is in language or speech production. And so if there are, so yeah, we can think about regions in the Broca's area contribute to language in different ways. If the damage is only limited to the Broca's area, that can result in minor or maybe even brief language impairment. Because again, there's a lot of different areas involved with speaking. It's not just Broca's area, but Broca's area is one of the big ones. That, yeah, when there's damage, that can have some impairment. And yeah, roles of different brain areas can change, especially when there's damage in some areas. It can affect other areas, right? Like there could be maybe compensation, which we've talked a little bit about before. That could be a possibility. But let's talk about Broca's aphasia, that non-fluent aphasia. And so what we see is that, yeah, there can be kind of that slower language. It could be more awkward. It usually does make sense, but there's that delay in trying to produce that speech. So this is not an issue with language comprehension. This is an issue with language production. And this includes for spoken language, this includes for sign language too, that making those gestures, there can be that delay in producing the symbol, in producing the sign. In terms of spoken language, in terms of English, that English speakers with Broca's aphasia seldomly use pronouns, prepositions, helping verbs, similar words. They might omit some words or word endings because the speech is a struggle. So they're just trying to get out what they're trying to say. So I'm kind of exaggerating to show like that it's the slower speech, and they might, you know, cut off some of the words and try to like just get it out, try to say what they're trying to say. So Wernicke's aphasia is referred to as fluent aphasia. Wernicke's area is near the auditory cortex. And when there's damage to this area, when there's Wernicke's aphasia, this is characterized by impaired language comprehension and impaired ability to remember object names. So this one, the speech production is not impaired. They can speak fluently. And that's why it's the fluent aphasia compared to the Broca's aphasia, the non-fluent, because with Broca's aphasia, it's that slower trying to get the words out kind of thing. With Wernicke's aphasia, it is fluent, blah, 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 they can speak things, but what they're saying may not make sense. Because here there's that issue with the language comprehension. So they may not even understand if somebody's asking them a question, they may not understand. Maybe they do, and then they're trying to respond, but what they're saying doesn't actually make sense. They might be stringing along different words together to answer the question. They do it very fluently. They're speaking, like smoothly, but again, what they're saying doesn't make sense. So yeah, articulate fluent speech, except with pauses to find the right word. There can be that anomia, that experiencing difficulty recalling the names of objects, and the poor language comprehension. So they can have a hard time understanding speech, understanding writing, or especially like even understanding sign language for those who use sign language. So this is a little bit of review of comparing Broca's aphasia and Wernicke's aphasia. And then here's that link to a video. I think we watched this earlier in the semester. Or if we didn't watch it in class, then I know I encourage you guys to watch it. This time, definitely watch it. And it'll show a couple of individuals, one with Broca's aphasia, one with Wernicke's aphasia, so you can see and hear the differences in their speech. Okay, so all of the videos in this lecture, except for that first one, the click language, I encourage you to watch the click language, but that video is optional. All of the other videos are required though, and they will help you understand what we're talking about. Okay, next time we will start talking about neuropsychology. This chapter is not in our textbook. This is Freeburg chapter 15. This one has been posted on Moodle, so if you haven't already taken a look at that, please do in preparation for the neuropsychology textbook. For this lecture topic, we do not have a cognition and language participation activity. Instead, what we're going to do, I'm going to post like a forum, like a sign-up sheet that as we're getting closer to the end of the semester and closer to the due date for the educational poem rap assignment, I'd like to know how many of you are going to, are planning to present on which day. Let me actually pull up the syllabus. Behavior syllabus, and let's see the March one. So in our schedule, so Wednesday, April 22nd, which is coming up soon. How many of you want to present on April 22nd? How many of you want to present on April 24th? So we can try to schedule that and plan for that. So instead of the participation activity for this topic, instead we're going to sign up for which day that we want to present on this. Okay? All right, I will talk to you guys soon. Have a good rest of your day.